This way, bud. Come on, this way. No, buddy, this way. People are funny. They love to use shaming terms, and they love to label people, and they love to try to fit them into these little tiny boxes. They hate when it's done to them, but they love to do it to other people. So, for example, if you have been the parent of an addicted child long enough to search for this site, you've undoubtedly experienced a slap in the face of being called a codependent. If you've ever walked into a 12-step program or any group based on the 12 steps, you've been called a codependent or a co-addict the moment you walk through the door without even opening your mouth. The problem is, though, what do you do with that? If you accept their diagnosis, you reinforce the fact that you are indeed a codependent or a co-addict. If you object to it, then that's just evidence that you are a codependent or a co-addict, because only a codependent or a co-addict would not recognize that they are a codependent or a co-addict. That makes no sense. There's no way to win this argument. But it gets even worse. If you accept that description, that diagnosis for who you are, that's extremely damaging to your own mental health and well-being. So we need to talk about the term codependent and co-addict. Let's go, buddy. Come on. Overgrown deer trail. Anyways, before we discuss that topic, I have a favor to ask of you. If you're finding this video helpful, please like it. If you're finding the series helpful, please follow us. If you need more information than I can possibly cover in these short little videos, please refer back to the book. If you've read the book, please consider reviewing it. Essentially, what these people are doing when they assign you the name codependent or the label codependent, they're diagnosing you with a disease or behavioral condition of codependency. But a diagnosis has to rely on specific measurable criteria. For example, if I'm to be diagnosed with epilepsy, I have to exhibit and demonstrate specific measurable criteria. I have to have repeated seizures, MRIs, EEGs, contrasts, and all of that have to rule out everything else and rule in abnormal brainwave activity in order for them to come to the specific diagnosis of epilepsy. So surely the mental health or behavioral condition of codependency or co-addict also has to have specific measurable criteria, right? Or, lacking specific measurable criteria, at least solid scientific findings or documented research that shows that all parents of addicted children suffer from codependency. Maybe most would be sufficient, but at least more than not would be the requirement, right? At the same time, in any field that you can think of, in order for a diagnosis to be valid, it has to come from someone we would normally expect has the ability to make such a diagnosis. And that diagnosis always is going to depend upon an individual assessment You might be a psychologist, but if I have PTSD, you can't assess that without specific testing. Codependency is a shaming term used to diagnose our behavior or our mental condition in relationship to our beloved children. Since it's a diagnosis, shouldn't we have at least the same ability, the same right, the same expectations that we would have if someone were to diagnose you with bacterial spinal meningeal encephalitis? Then why is it the answer to all three of those questions, those conditions for diagnosis, are negative? Before we get too wound up about a term, would it surprise you to know the experts can't agree on how to spell it? They can't agree on the symptoms. They can't agree on a description. They can't agree on even how to pronounce it. Is it codependent, codependent, codependent? They can't agree on any of that. Here's what's going on. The whole concept of codependency is hogwash. It is a completely made up concept. It is an abstract where we take groups of this behavior and 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 need a name to describe it. But they can't even figure out what's included in that group of different behaviors. So those are the experts. So should you be too worried about someone saying you're a codependent? Another way of looking at it might be like this. Are you real? Of course you are. Is codependency real? No, we just discovered it's a made-up imaginary construct. Can something imaginary determine the reality of something real? Only if you accept it as a definition of who you are yourself. Now, there is a group of behaviors that we classify under the heading of codependency. But remember, behaviors are taught, and the family of behaviors that we classify as codependency were taught to you normally by your addicted child in an effort to keep alive and support the addiction. It's nothing against you. That's how they need to do to support the addiction. But remember, you are so much more than a group of behaviors. You're a real, loving, valuable human being, and the world is better off for having known you. For you being in it, we are a better place. So, are you codependent? No. It's impossible to be something that's imaginary. Okay? You're not Peter Pan either. By the same token, do you exhibit the behaviors that we classify as codependent? Possibly. But there's a better way to ask that question, a way that you can ask yourself. So let's talk a little bit about what those questions are that will help you determine which behaviors you want to change. Rather than asking if we're codependent, let's take a look at the behaviors themselves. Let's describe the behaviors instead of labeling people. So, first question to ask yourself, are my behaviors supporting my child, or are they supporting the addiction? If you know that your child is going to spend the money that you give them on drugs, or there's a high likelihood of it, and you give them money, which one are you supporting? If your child makes a deal with you one more fix and I'll go to rehab. They've already told you they're not interested in rehab. They want one more fix. If you agree to that, what are your behaviors telling you? Second question, if my behaviors are supporting the addiction more than my child, why am I behaving this way? Is it something I need? Do I need to be needed? Third question, do my behaviors reveal the fact that I'm beginning to lose my boundaries for where my child begins and I end, or where my child ends and I begin? Do I have boundaries that say, this is me, that's you? If I don't, why don't I? Because any healthy relationship has to have boundaries. Fourth question, if I'm losing my boundaries, if I'm supporting the addiction more than I'm supporting the child, am I willing to change? If not, why not? This way, focusing on the behaviors takes the shaming terms out completely and lets you simply say, am I doing these unhelpful behaviors? If so, how can I change these unhelpful behaviors to much more helpful behaviors? Just as this is a much easier trail to walk than the trail we walked earlier at the beginning of the video, I do think this is a much easier and much more helpful way to look at life by behaviors instead of labels, by looking at our own behaviors versus what other people want to label us as. I think this is a nicer path to walk. Don't you? Apollo, let's go, buddy.